Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Ancient History Jewelry Stories podcast. If you are here, then you probably already know that my name is Melise, and I have a daily video series called Ancient History Jewelry Stories on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, where I approach history through the lens of jewelry. You can find me on all of those platforms at moonhoney.jewelry, and I do post slightly longer edits of my videos on TikTok and YouTube because they don't have a time limit for uploads. This month's podcast episodes have been a companion piece to the deep dive series I've been doing on archaeological revival jewelry. This is part 2 of 2 episodes. The first episode we covered Hellenistic revival and Etruscan revival jewelry. You can listen to this one as a standalone, but I do recommend that you go back and listen to the first one for some better background, especially because we are going to be discussing our friend Napoleon Bonaparte yet again. He does make an appearance in the first episode. This episode we are, of course, focusing on the much-awaited Egyptian revival jewelry style. I have had a lot of people tell me that this is their favorite style of jewelry, and it's definitely one of my favorite styles too. I think there's a good reason why Egyptian revival speaks to people in a different way than Hellenistic or Etruscan revival does. And that's because, unlike other revival styles, Egyptian revival wasn't so much about copying as it was about interpreting themes. In a way, Egyptian revival style isn't a revival style at all. It's an entirely new style made up by combining Victorian aesthetic sensibilities with Egyptian motifs and symbols. If you watched last week's Deep Dive Wednesday video on Egyptian revival jewelry, then you will know that it went through 3 distinct phases. This all really started at the tail end of the 18th century, where the very first archaeological finds were being made by Europeans in Egypt. By the time that Napoleon Bonaparte waged his campaign in Egypt and Syria between 1798 and 1801, there was already a growing interest in ancient Egypt in Europe. The first wave of what can be called Egyptomania reached its peak with Napoleon's campaign in Egypt. I'm not going to get into the reasons why Napoleon was in Egypt. There are a lot of podcasts that can cover that better than I can. But one thing that made his campaign really unusual was the inclusion of what were called savants. This was a group of scientists and scholars who were brought along on his campaign. There were 167 of them in total. This group included mathematicians, naturalists, botanists, engineers, and artists. Part of this was a legitimate interest in Egypt and an attempt to document what was found during these campaigns. But of course, because Napoleon Bonaparte was a noted bullshit artist, an even bigger part of it was propaganda. This can be seen as an attempt at obfuscating his true intentions in Egypt and Syria. One of the major discoveries made while Napoleon was in Egypt was that of the Rosetta Stone. This was discovered in 1799 by a young engineering officer named Pierre-François Bouchard, and this was the very first time that researchers were able to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics. Of course, one of the major motivations for this campaign was also that Napoleon could bring back whatever the hell he wanted to. He took antiquities, he took monuments, he took whatever he wanted as spoils of war. Although interestingly, a lot of the antiquities were signed over to the British after the campaign as part of a treaty. Because of the inclusion of scientists and artists, there were 2 major publications that came out of this campaign that influenced art and design for the rest of the century. Forewarning, I don't speak French and my pronunciation is not very good, so pardon me. The first was the publication of a book called Mémoires sur l'Égypte, followed about a decade later by Description de l'Égypte. These 2 books and the illustrations within them helped to give rise to a major fascination with Egypt throughout all of Europe. Napoleon's campaign, the publications that came out of it, the antiquities that he stole and brought back with him, all of these contributed to this very fetishized Orientalism that was all the rage in the 19th century. This romantic idea of the Orient that included beautiful dark-eyed women in diaphanous gauze, crumbling ancient structures in the sand, marketplaces full of vibrant silks. For my favorite schlockiest reference, you can go look up the artwork of Sir Lawrence Alma-Tadema. The second wave of interest in archaeological revival jewelry came about with the discovery of the tomb of Queen Ahotep II. Her tomb was discovered in 1859, and while her mummy was destroyed pretty soon after discovery, her tomb was full of gold and silver jewelry and artifacts. Side note here, we don't know what happened to Queen Ahotep II's mummy, and when I made a video about her, I got about 700 comments saying that she was probably eaten by people in the Victorian era. Please don't leave me comments saying that she was probably eaten by people in the Victorian era. We've discussed Ahotep in a few different videos. She was the owner of that incredible giant gold fly necklace that I love so much. This was a very special piece of jewelry because these giant gold flies were generally represented to people who showed valor in war, meaning that Queen Ahotep was a warrior queen. The discovery of Ahotep's tomb and her incredible burial goods did go on to influence jewelry and fashion, but this second wave of interest really exploded with the completion of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal, which connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, was under construction for a decade, from 1859 to 1869. And as you can imagine, by the time it was completed, it was the major news story all around the world. Just for context on how important the Suez Canal was, the time it would have saved for a 19th century steamship traveling from Europe to Bombay would have been anywhere between 24 and 37 days. The canal cut an entire month off of a Victorian-era journey to the east. Of course, this greatly impacted trade between Europe, the Mediterranean, and Asia, and consequently, as trade moved westward from Asia to Europe, more goods were flowing into Europe from Egypt as well. We are now deep in the grind-up mummies and use them as paint and medicine era of Victorian Egyptology. This was the time when mummies were very famously being ground up and made into medication, being used as fuel on railways. The adventurous gentility would have mummy unwrapping parties where they would unwrap the linens layer by layer to see what fun talismans they would find, like a cursed Cracker Jack box. Mummies were ground into a pigment that was very creatively called mummy brown. And every once in a while, some rich guy would prop a mummy up in his living room as decor. Egyptomania had fully taken hold, and as a result, thousands of Egyptian mummies were destroyed, including those of Egyptian royalty. This second wave of Egyptian revival jewelry experienced one last little peak of interest in 1890, when the famous French actress Sarah Bernhardt played Cleopatra in a stage performance. As the style of jewelry itself evolved throughout the 19th century, we start to see more and more actual Egyptian antiquities incorporated into the jewelry itself. Starting in the middle of the 19th century, there was a trend for necklaces made out of ancient Egyptian scarabs, very similar to the necklaces that had been made using ancient Greek and Roman carved stones. During this time, the majority of the jewelers that we talked about in episode 1 were also dabbling in Egyptian revival. Even Castellani made quite a few pieces in the Egyptian revival style, often incorporating actual ancient scarabs. These Egyptian revival pieces did not sell as well for their Italian market, but that didn't stop them, and they created some very beautiful and colorful examples of Egyptian revival jewelry. Now, this third wave of Egyptian revival jewelry is the one that I think had the most cultural impact and is the one that I think most people are familiar with. This one coincides with the discovery of the tomb of King Tutankhamun. King Tut and his phenomenal glittering tomb were discovered in 1922 by Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon. After World War I put a hold on their attempts to find the tomb, they were ready to give up, and they were at the end of their very last season of digging when they finally came across the tomb of King Tutankhamun. Just a little backstory, because I do think it's interesting how this tomb came to be so important in our modern popular culture. King Tut was 19 when he died. He was an Egyptian pharaoh of fairly little consequence. Had his tomb not been found fully intact and crammed full of the most incredible treasure, he would be a footnote in history. And there are two reasons why his tomb survived to the modern age unlooted, because looting was a very real problem in ancient Egypt. Despite the tomb being found full of treasure, there is evidence that it was looted at least twice in antiquity. In fact, often the people looting the tombs were the priests who were responsible for the tombs. The first reason why King Tut's tomb was hidden is physical. Because of where it was situated, the tomb was covered in debris that had washed over the entrance over the intervening millennia. It was entirely covered in a thin layer of gravel and looked exactly like the surrounding landscape. The second reason why this tomb was still intact had more to do with the politics of the time than anything else. King Tutankhamun was the son of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. In fact, based on some of the funerary goods in his tomb, Tutankhamun's original name was Tutankhaten. During Tutankhamun's lifetime, and after his death, the pharaohs that followed Akhenaten attempted to erase him and his son from history. Akhenaten had committed the grave sin of forcing his people to switch to monotheism, the worship of a single god. Instead of worshipping a pantheon of different gods, Akhenaten worshipped only one, Aten, the sun god. If you're at all familiar with the art from this period, then you will know that it looks very strange compared to any other ancient Egyptian art. Fortunately, despite attempts to erase Akhenaten and Tutankhamun from history, enough examples of art from that time period have survived. The reign of Akhenaten is known as the Amarna period. Because of the apparent lack of Tutankhamun in the ancient Egyptian records, And the entrance of the tomb was so well hidden, by the time that Howard Carter broke the seal and opened the doors in 1922, the tomb was still filled with an array of glittering golden objects, everything from shoes and clothing to jewelry and furniture, all of the finery that a king could expect to need in the afterlife. The discovery of this tomb became an overnight sensation, and people were traveling all the way to Egypt to get a glimpse at the treasures that were being carted out of the tomb. Every day, tourists would line up in the sweltering heat under their parasols and watch as crate after crate of wonderful glittering treasure was taken out of the tomb. If you are alive on this planet, you have most likely seen, at the very least, King Tutankhamun's burial mask, which, whether or not it was made for him, is up for debate. I've done a video on this. I'm fairly certain it was made for Nefertiti. Original intended owner aside, the sheer beauty of the pieces being found in this tomb were a major influence on Art Deco design. The Art Deco aesthetic has a stranglehold on the 1920s, and you see everything from the flora and fauna of Egypt to these repeated geometric designs being echoed in the Art Deco movement. One of the major jewelers that was working in the Egyptian Revival style during the 1920s was Cartier. In fact, they started working in Egyptian Revival style well before King Tutankhamun's tomb was found. Starting around 1910, and using Napoleon's Description de l'Égypte as their inspiration, they started to produce jewels that not only included Egyptian motifs and designs, but actual Egyptian antiquities. Everything from small figurines to faience scarabs. These antiquities were mounted in increasingly complicated and beautifully designed settings made out of white gold and multicolored gemstones. Onyx, sapphire, ruby, emerald, jade, carnelian, lapis, and turquoise were very popular choices for Egyptian Revival jewels. Tiffany & Company also got in on the Egyptian Revival trend. Their most popular product was jewelry made using their cast glass beetles. Van Cleef & Arpels also had a very successful line of Egyptian Revival jewelry. As Art Deco design became more two-dimensional towards the end of the 20s, Egyptian Revival styles became more two-dimensional as well. This is when you start to see a flattening of motifs, less of these sculptural relief pieces like carved scarabs, and everything starts to become a little bit more graphically simplified. Egyptian Revival, more than any of the other Revival jewelry trends, was one that really managed to jump outside of the confines of the fine jewelry world. Egyptian Revival jewelry very quickly made its way into every niche of jewelry and fashion. You see so many influences in the costume jewelry of the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. In fact, some of the biggest names in costume jewelry at the time, like Miriam Haskell, made beautiful pieces inspired by ancient Egyptian finds. Egyptian Revival jewelry and Egyptian Revival fashion continued to be popular throughout the 20th century. It majorly influenced the look and feel of Golden Era Hollywood, and it never really quite went away. It experienced yet another resurgence in interest in the 1960s and 1970s, coinciding with an interest in all things mystical and ancient. While you can definitely see the traces of Hellenistic and Etruscan Revival jewelry in modern trends, like, say, the fringe necklace and cameos, I don't think they had quite the staying power or the impact on 20th and 21st century fashions as Egyptian Revival jewelry has. Well, we've come to the end of part 2 of this two-parter about archaeological revival jewelry. Somehow this second episode ended up being even shorter than the first. I promise I tried to make it longer. I don't know how I crammed all this info into less than 15 minutes, but we did it. We managed to get through the Hellenistic, the Etruscan, and the Egyptian Revival story. Hopefully this gives you a better background on why the jewelry of the 19th and 20th century looks the way it does, because I do think we've taken basically every interesting trend and style from an ancient archaeological find. It just goes to show that there has not been an original idea in at least 2,000 years. If you'd like to find me in other places online, you can watch my videos on TikTok, YouTube, or Instagram under the username moonhoney.jewelry. You can find me by searching for ancient history jewelry stories on any of these platforms. If you would like to see my goldsmithing work and the jewelry that I make, you can find me at shopmoonhoney.com. And if you would like to support me on Patreon, it's patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories. Yes, I'm sorry. That one is a lot to type out. If you join at the $5 a month tier, you get to vote on future topics for videos and deep dives and podcast episodes. Since I'm already here shilling, I'd love it if you guys left me a review and rated this podcast wherever you happen to be listening. As always, thank you all for being here, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks for more ancient history jewelry stories.